What happens when the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company walks into one of his own stores late at night, disguised as an ordinary customer? He expected business as usual, but what he found was shocking. Overworked employees, hidden injustices, and a heartbreaking secret buried in the back room. What he witnessed will change everything, and it might just break your heart. Stay tuned to uncover the untold story behind the company you thought you knew. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. "I can't keep doing this," the young man whispered, his voice trembling. He was clutching a crumpled paper bag, his knuckles white as he held it against his chest. "If they find out, I'm done." "You're not done," the older woman hissed back, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Her name tag, scratched and faded, barely hung onto her worn uniform. "You're surviving, that's what matters. Now take it and go before someone sees." The man hesitated, his hands shaking as he looked at her. "This isn't right, Clara. What if—" "Go!" she snapped, her voice low but urgent. "Do you want your kid to starve? Just take it." The man didn't argue again. He shoved the bag into his jacket and darted toward the exit, his footsteps quick and silent against the tiled floor. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on the door until it closed behind him. Then she exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. From behind the corner, the CEO watched everything, his pulse pounding in his ears. He hadn't intended to overhear, but the tension in their voices had pulled him closer. What the hell had he just witnessed? A theft? A bribe? And why did Clara, one of the company's most loyal employees, look like she was about to break under the pressure? Whatever it wasn't in the employee handbook. The CEO lingered near the shelves, his mind racing as he replayed the exchange he had just witnessed. Clara, the steadfast employee who had spent decades building trust within the company, was hiding something. The way she'd spoken, firm but almost desperate, didn't match the polished image her performance reviews had painted. He couldn't ignore it. Keeping a casual demeanor, he made his way toward the checkout counter, where Clara now stood, her hands methodically scanning items for the few late-night customers trickling through. Her shoulders were stiff, her movements mechanical, but her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. She looked up briefly as he approached, giving him the same wary smile as before. "Back again?" she asked, her voice tinged with a hint of dry humor. "Couldn't stay away," he replied lightly, placing a random item on the counter. "Busy night?" Her smile faltered for a second, just long enough for him to catch it. "Depends on what you call busy," she said, avoiding his gaze as she rang up his purchase. "Not many customers, but there's always something to do. Must be hard running things with such a small crew," he said, testing the waters. Clara's hand stilled for a moment on the register. "It is what it is," she said quietly, before quickly handing him his receipt. "Gotta keep the lights on." He took the receipt, but didn't move, watching her closely. "Doesn't seem like they make it easy for you." Her eyes snapped to his, sharp and assessing, before she looked away. "You ask a lot of questions for someone just buying a soda." Before he could respond, a voice called out from the back of the store. "Clara, we've got a problem in aisle 3. It was a younger employee, barely out of their teens, waving frantically. Clara sighed, her exhaustion visible in every step as she hurried off to assist. The CEO watched her go, then turned his attention to the rest of the store. He noticed the younger employee, Jamie, now juggling an armful of products while trying to clean up what looked like a broken jar on the floor. They looked frantic, their movements rushed and uncoordinated, as though they were trying to handle 5 tasks at once. "Need a hand?" the CEO asked, stepping closer. Jamie looked up startled and shook their head. No, I've got it. Thanks though." Their voice was tight, their face flushed. "You sure? Looks like you've got your hands full." Jamie gave a nervous laugh. "Welcome to the night shift, we're used to it." The CEO crouched down anyway, helping to gather the broken shards into a dustpan. "Seems like a lot for one person." Jamie hesitated, glancing toward the back of the store as though afraid of being overheard. "There's not really anyone else," they muttered. "It's just me and Clara tonight." "Just the two of you? Isn't there supposed to be a manager on duty?" Jamie bit their lip, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Klein's around, somewhere." They quickly changed the subject. "Thanks for the help. I'll take care of it from here." The CEO didn't press further, but his mind was already racing again. A skeleton crew, an absent manager, employees stretched thin, and Clara acting as though she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Something was deeply wrong here, and he was determined to find out what it was. The CEO lingered near the shelves, pretending to browse while keeping an eye on the scene unfolding. Clara had disappeared toward the back of the store, where Jamie now stood wiping their brow with the sleeve of their uniform. The kid looked utterly drained, their eyes darting nervously toward the shadows at the edge of the stockroom door. Whatever was happening here wasn't just mismanagement, it was something heavier, more deliberate. After a moment, the CEO decided to investigate further. He wandered deeper into the store, letting his steps echo faintly against the tile floor. Passing the stockroom, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the faint hum of refrigeration units mixed with the low murmur of voices. "I told you to log those hours as training," a gruff voice said. The CEO froze, recognizing the tone of authority immediately. "We can't afford to hit overtime again this week." "That's not fair, Mr. Klein," a second voice replied. It was Clara's. "Jamie's been here for 12-hour shifts 3 days in a row. You can't keep telling them this doesn't count." "You think I make the rules?" Klein snapped back, his voice lowering into a hiss. "Corporate's the one cutting hours, not me. If you've got a problem with it, take it up with them." "Oh wait, you can't because they don't give a damn about what happens in stores like this." There was a long pause, filled only by the distant hum of machinery. "That doesn't mean we treat them like this," Clara said, her voice steely but laced with frustration. "They're kids, Klein. They're doing their best." "And so am I," he replied, his tone dripping with mockery. "Now get back out there before someone starts wondering why you're slacking off." The CEO stepped away quickly, his heart pounding as he processed what he had just overheard. The implications were clear. Hours were being manipulated to avoid paying overtime, and employees were being pushed far beyond their limits under the guise of following corporate orders. The anger in Clara's voice echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the way she'd stood up for Jamie despite being clearly outnumbered and overpowered by her manager. He moved further into the store, trying to keep his composure as his thoughts churned. In one aisle, he spotted Jamie again, struggling to restock a high shelf with a heavy box. Without thinking, the CEO stepped in to help, holding the box steady as Jamie pushed it into place. "Thanks," Jamie muttered, wiping their hands on their apron. "I don't know what's going on with me tonight. I'm just out of it." "You're doing a lot," the CEO said gently. "Anyone would be exhausted after what you've been through." Jamie laughed bitterly. "You have no idea. Sometimes I think about quitting, but I can't afford to. Between rent, school, and everything else." Their voice trailed off and they looked down at their shoes. "Anyway, it's not like anyone would care." "I think Clara cares," the CEO said, testing the waters. Jamie's face softened slightly. "Yeah, she does. She's the only reason this place hasn't fallen apart. She's always covering shifts and helping everyone out, even when she shouldn't have to. If I didn't have her to talk to sometimes, I don't think I'd make it." "Sounds like she does a lot for this store," the CEO said. "What about Mr. Klein?" Jamie stiffened immediately, their expression guarded. I don't really deal with him much. He mostly stays in the back." They shifted nervously. "Look, I should probably get back to work. Thanks for the help." The CEO nodded, letting Jamie retreat down the aisle, but the unease in their voice lingered. It was clear that whatever was happening here extended far beyond a single overworked employee or a bad manager. Clara was holding this place together with sheer force of will, but at what cost? And why wasn't anyone higher up the chain doing anything about it? His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the front of the store. A customer was shouting, their voice carrying through the aisles. The CEO hurried over to see what was happening. "I've been standing here for 10 minutes," the customer bellowed, slamming their items onto the counter. "Where the hell is everyone?" Clara appeared from the back, her face flushed but calm. "I'm sorry for the wait, sir," she said smoothly, stepping behind the register. "I'll take care of this right away." "About time," the man muttered, crossing his arms as Clara rang up his purchases with practiced efficiency. The CEO could see her hands trembling slightly, but she never let her professionalism falter. When the transaction was complete, the man grabbed his bags and stormed out without so much as a thank you. Clara let out a long breath as she watched him go. Then, as if sensing someone nearby, she glanced over and caught the CEO's eye. For a moment, she looked like she might say something, but instead, she just shook her head and went back to work. He wanted to approach her, to ask more questions, but he knew it wasn't the right time. There was more to uncover, and he needed to tread carefully if he wanted to get the full picture. Whatever was going on in this store, it was worse than he'd imagined, and he was only beginning to scratch the surface. The air in the stockroom was colder than the rest of the store, and the CEO could feel the chill even from where he stood outside the door. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop again, but the voices inside carried a sharp, cutting tone that made it impossible to ignore. "I don't care if it's expired," Klein barked, his voice rising in frustration. "It stays on the shelves until corporate says otherwise. We don't have the budget to waste inventory." Clara's response was quieter, but no less firm. "You're putting people at risk, Klein. You know that." "Don't lecture me," he snapped. "If you have a problem with it, maybe you should think about retiring early. I'm sure someone younger would love to have your job." There was silence for a moment before Clara replied, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "You don't scare me, Klein. You might think you can bully everyone else, but not me." "Then do your job," Klein growled. "And stop acting like you run this place." The CEO's fists clenched at his sides as he listened, torn between stepping in and staying hidden. The dynamic between Klein and Clara was becoming clearer with every interaction he observed. Clara was trying to protect the employees and the customers, while Klein seemed solely focused on cutting costs and maintaining his authority. It was a toxic combination, and the store was suffering because of it. He turned away from the stockroom and headed toward the aisles, needing to clear his head. As he walked, he noticed Jamie again, this time crouched near the produce section, carefully removing bruised and wilted items from the shelves. The CEO approached, keeping his movements casual. "You're really thorough," he said, leaning slightly on the cart Jamie was using to collect the damaged produce. Jamie looked up, startled, but relaxed when they saw him. "It's just part of the job," they said, shrugging. "If it's bad, customers complain. And if customers complain, well, you know how it goes." "Do you get in trouble for throwing things away?" he asked, thinking back to Klein's earlier outburst. Jamie hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Technically, yeah," they admitted. "Mr. Klein doesn't like us wasting anything. He says it's better to discount it or just leave it out for a while longer." "And how do you feel about that?" the CEO pressed gently. Jamie gave a bitter laugh. "I don't know. I guess it's not my decision to make. I just do what I'm told." The CEO nodded thoughtfully, filing away Jamie's words as another piece of the puzzle. As they worked together to finish clearing the shelf, he noticed a faint smell coming from the cart. One of the items was rotting, its odor masked until it was up close. Jamie wrinkled their nose. "Guess that one's been here a little too long," they said, tossing the offending fruit into the bin with a grimace. The CEO decided to shift the conversation. "So, how long have you been working here?" "Almost a year," Jamie replied. "Started last summer to save for school, but you know how that goes. Bills pile up and suddenly it's not just a summer job anymore." "Do you like it here?" he asked, curious to hear their perspective. Jamie hesitated, their expression conflicted. "I like the people," they said finally. "Clara especially. She looks out for everyone, but it's hard, you know. It feels like no one really cares about us. Not the customers, not corporate. We're just here." Their words hit harder than the CEO expected. He had prided himself on creating a company culture of respect and opportunity, but if this store was any indication, those values weren't reaching the ground floor. Somewhere along the way, the message had gotten lost, and people like Jamie and Clara were paying the price. As Jamie moved on to the next aisle, the CEO stood there for a moment, his mind racing with questions. How many other stores were like this? How many other employees felt abandoned and undervalued? And how much of it was his fault? Lost in thought, he almost didn't notice the commotion happening near the front of the store. A young mother with 2 children was arguing with the cashier, her voice strained and panicked. "Please, just give me a little more time," she was saying, clutching a small bag of groceries. "I'll come back and pay the rest tomorrow. I promise." "I can't do that," the cashier replied, looking apologetic but firm. "It's against store policy." The CEO felt his chest tighten as he watched the scene unfold. The children were clinging to their mother's legs, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Clara appeared suddenly, stepping in to de-escalate the situation. "It's okay," she said softly, placing a hand on the mother's arm. "Take the food. I'll cover the difference." The mother's face crumpled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Clara said gently. "Just take care of your kids." The CEO watched in stunned silence as the mother left, clutching her groceries tightly to her chest. Clara returned to the register, her expression calm but weary. It was another small act of kindness, in a place that seemed determined to snuff out every spark of humanity. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had to change, and it had to start with him. The weight of what he had witnessed lingered with the CEO as he moved to the quieter corners of the store. Clara's selflessness and quiet resilience, Jamie's exhaustion, the mother's desperation, it all painted a picture far more dire than he had imagined. He couldn't shake the image of Clara calmly handing over her own money to cover the mother's groceries. That wasn't policy, that was pure humanity, and it was being buried under a system designed to crush it. Determined to dig deeper, he wandered toward the back of the store, where an unmarked door caught his attention. It wasn't the stockroom door, but a smaller, less conspicuous one tucked into the corner. It had a rusted lock hanging loosely on the latch, and a handwritten sign taped to it read, "Staff Only." A low hum of voices came from the other side. The CEO hesitated, unsure if he should proceed, but his curiosity outweighed his caution. He knocked lightly, the sound echoing through the empty aisle. The murmurs stopped abruptly, replaced by a long silence. Finally the door creaked open a sliver, and Clara's face appeared. Her expression shifted from surprise to guarded suspicion when she saw him. "What are you doing back here?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "I was just exploring," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Is everything okay?" Clara stepped out and pulled the door closed behind her, blocking his view of whatever, or whoever, was inside. "This is a staff area," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Customers aren't allowed back here." He could see the tension in her face, the way her eyes darted to the sides as though she was checking to make sure no one else was nearby. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, stepping back slightly. "I just thought I heard something." "It's fine," she said quickly, her voice clipped. "You should go back out to the front. We're closing soon." Something about her tone, the way she almost seemed protective of whatever was behind that door, made him pause. But before he could say anything else, Clara turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff with unspoken stress. The CEO lingered for a moment, his eyes fixed on the door. What was she hiding, and why did she look so tense about it? He glanced around the store to make sure no one was watching, then moved closer. He pressed his ear to the door, but all he could hear was the faint hum of machinery. Whatever was happening back there, Clara clearly didn't want him, or anyone else, to know about it. As he returned to the main floor, he saw Klein emerge from the manager's office, his expression sour and impatient. He barked orders at Jamie, who was attempting to restock a shelf while also handling a customer inquiry. The CEO noticed how Jamie flinched slightly every time Klein spoke, their shoulders hunching, as though bracing for impact. "Hey you!" Klein called out suddenly, pointing toward the CEO. "This isn't a playground. If you're not buying anything, get out." The CEO squared his shoulders, suppressing the urge to reveal his identity right then and there. "Just grabbing a few things," he said evenly, holding up a random can of soup he'd picked up earlier. Klein narrowed his eyes but said nothing, turning his attention back to Jamie. "And you? Move faster. You're not getting paid to stand around." Jamie mumbled an apology, their hands fumbling as they tried to keep up. The CEO clenched his jaw, the tension in the store becoming almost unbearable. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic, ingrained in the very fabric of how this store operated. As the night wore on, the CEO noticed more and more cracks in the facade. Expired food tucked behind fresh items, employees whispering nervously when they thought no one was listening, the flicker of fear in their eyes whenever Klein was nearby. It was all adding up to something much bigger, something he couldn't ignore. Finally, as the last customer left and the doors were locked, the CEO decided to make his move. Clara was counting the till at the register, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Jamie was sweeping the floors, their movements slow and deliberate, as though every step took immense effort. The CEO approached Clara, his voice low. "Can we talk?" he asked. She looked up, startled. "About what?" "About what's really going on here," he said, his tone firm but not accusatory. "I've seen enough tonight to know something's wrong, and I think you know it too." Clara's face hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he pressed. "I saw what you did for that woman earlier. I heard what you said to Klein in the stockroom. You're trying to protect everyone, but you can't do it alone." Clara's jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she might walk away. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as though the weight she had been carrying all night was finally too much. "It's not something I can talk about," she said quietly. "Not with you." "Why not?" he asked. "I just want to help." She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and humorless. "Help? No offense, but people like you don't help. You come in, you see what you want to see, and then you leave, and we're the ones who are left cleaning up the mess." Her words stung, but they were laced with a truth he couldn't deny. "Maybe I've been looking the other way," he admitted. "But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until I understand what's really going on." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she shook her head. "You don't know what you're asking," she said. "And if you're smart, you'll let it go." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The store was eerily silent as Clara disappeared into the back, her words lingering in the air like a challenge. The CEO stood motionless for a moment, the weight of her statement pressing down on him. He had never been called out so directly, and certainly not by someone like Clara. Yet her words struck a chord, peeling back layers of complacency he hadn't realized he'd wrapped himself in. His resolve hardened. If Clara wouldn't open up to him willingly, he'd find the truth another way. He made his way toward the stockroom once again, the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the faint clicking of Jamie's broom filling the void. The small unmarked door from earlier was still there, looming at the edge of his vision. He glanced around the store. Jamie was preoccupied at the far end of an aisle, and Klein seemed to have vanished back into his office. Now was his chance. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The dim light inside revealed a cramped, cluttered space filled with discarded equipment, boxes of outdated promotional materials, and what looked like old, handwritten employee schedules pinned to a corkboard. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the flickering fluorescent light overhead made the room feel even more oppressive. But what caught his attention immediately was the pile of papers scattered across a makeshift desk. Among them were what appeared to be employee complaint forms, dozens of them, all half crumpled and smudged with ink. He picked up one and scanned it quickly. Hours cut without notice, asked to come in on off days with no overtime pay. Manager said if I complained, I'd lose my shifts altogether. The next one was no better. My pay hasn't been right for weeks. Every time I bring it up, I'm told it's a system issue, but it never gets fixed. I need this job so I don't know what else to do. And another. Working the overnight shift alone is unsafe. I've been harassed twice by customers, and no one even called to check on me after I reported it. The CEO felt his chest tighten as he read the stories of his employees, his people, laid bare in ink and paper. These weren't just complaints, they were cries for help. And they had been ignored, shoved into this dingy room to gather dust. He continued sifting through the papers until he found a folder labeled Terminations. Inside were detailed reports of employees who had been let go, most of them for vague reasons like poor performance or violation of company policy. But as he read further, a pattern began to emerge. Many of these employees had filed complaints just weeks before their termination dates. It was retaliation, plain and simple. A sudden noise outside the door jolted him from his thoughts. He froze, holding his breath as heavy footsteps approached. The door swung open, and Klein stood there, his face twisting in anger when he saw the CEO holding the papers. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Klein barked, stepping into the room and slamming the door behind him. The CEO squared his shoulders, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "What are you doing, Klein? These are employee complaints. Serious ones. Why are they shoved in here instead of being addressed?" Klein scoffed, crossing his arms. "You think I have time to deal with every little gripe from a bunch of kids who can't handle a real job? Grow up." "These aren't just gripes," the CEO shot back, his voice rising. "These are violations of labor laws for starters. And more than that, they're cries for help. These people are exhausted, mistreated, and scared. And you're sitting here ignoring them? You don't get it," Klein snarled, his face reddening. "Corporate doesn't care about this crap. They care about the numbers, profits, efficiency. You think anyone up there would back me up if I started spending more on labor? Hell no, they'd fire me just as fast as any of these complainers." The CEO's stomach churned at the words. "So, you think this is acceptable? That it's okay to cut corners and treat people like disposable cogs because it's easier? Don't act like you're some saint," Klein snapped. "You're just another customer, and you don't know what it's like to be in my shoes." The CEO stepped closer, his voice lowering to an icy calm. "You're wrong. I know exactly what it's like to be on the ground, pulling late-night shifts and doing whatever it takes to make things work, and I can tell you right now, this isn't how it should be." Klein faltered for a moment, but his arrogance returned quickly. "Whatever. Go ahead and report me. See how far that gets you. This store will chew you up and spit you out just like the rest of us." The CEO didn't reply. He simply walked past Klein, the folder of complaints still clutched in his hand. His mind was racing, but one thing was certain: the problems in this store ran deeper than Klein's mismanagement. They were systemic, built into the very culture he had created, and now he had to reckon with the consequences. As he stepped back into the main store, Clara was waiting for him, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "You found it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He nodded, his voice thick. "I did." She sighed, looking older than her years in that moment. "Now you know. But knowing doesn't change anything." "Maybe not yet," he said, his jaw tightening. "But it will." The store felt heavier now, the weight of its secrets pressing down on every corner. The CEO stood near the register, staring blankly at the stack of complaints he had pulled from the back room. Clara watched him from a distance, her expression unreadable, while Jamie quietly finished mopping the last aisle. Klein had retreated back into his office, slamming the door behind him, leaving the store in an uneasy silence. Finally, Clara approached him, her voice soft but firm. "You can't fix this, you know. Not tonight, not by yourself." He looked at her, his frustration evident. "I can't just leave it like this. People are being mistreated. This isn't how it's supposed to work." Clara folded her arms, her exhaustion showing in every line of her face. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it every day? We're just trying to get by here, to survive. But the system isn't built for people like us. It's built to squeeze every last ounce of work out of us, until there's nothing left." Her words cut deep, but the CEO didn't flinch. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "What if I told you I'm not just another customer, that I can do something about this?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm the CEO of this company," he said, his voice steady but tinged with guilt. "And I had no idea things were this bad." For a moment, Clara just stared at him, her expression frozen in disbelief. Then she let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You're kidding, right? You're telling me the guy who runs this whole operation just walked in here like some undercover boss?" He didn't react to the sarcasm, his gaze unwavering. "I needed to see it for myself," he said. "And now I have. But I need your help to fix it." "Fix it?" Clara shook her head, the anger rising in her voice. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can just snap your fingers and make it all better. You can't undo years of cuts, years of treating people like they're nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet." "I know it won't be easy," he admitted. "But I'm not walking away from this, not now." Clara stared at him, her expression softening slightly, though the skepticism remained. "If you're serious about this," she said quietly, "then you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about one store or one bad manager, it's the whole system. And people like Klein, they thrive on the fact that no one ever holds them accountable." "I'm holding him accountable," the CEO said firmly, "and I'm starting with this store. But I need to know everything, everything he's done, everything this team has been through. I need to hear it from you." For the first time, Clara hesitated. She glanced around the empty store, her gaze lingering on Jamie, who was quietly stacking boxes in the corner. "You really think you can change this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't just think it," he replied. "I know it." Clara sighed, a long, weary sound, and finally nodded. "All right. You want to know the truth? Let's start with Jamie." The CEO followed her gaze to the young employee, who looked even more tired now than they had earlier in the night. Clara motioned for him to follow her to the break room, a cramped, dingy space with peeling paint and a single flickering light bulb. She closed the door behind them and leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "Jamie's been here for almost a year," Clara began, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "Smart kid, hard worker. But Klein's been running them into the ground. Double shifts, no overtime pay, cutting their hours at random just to keep the books balanced. And when Jamie complained, he threatened to cut their schedule completely." The CEO's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "How is this allowed to happen?" Clara gave him a tired smile. "Because no one's looking. No one from corporate ever comes down here unless it's to nitpick over sales numbers or demand we cut costs. Klein knows that as long as the store turns a profit, no one's going to question how he does it." "And the complaints I found in the back room?" he asked. "Why didn't anyone send them up the chain?" Clara's face darkened. "You think Klein lets those leave the store? He shreds most of them. The ones you found were probably the ones he forgot about. As far as corporate knows, everything's running smoothly down here." The CEO leaned against the table, running a hand through his hair. He had always believed in the vision he had for the company, a place where employees felt valued, where customers received the best service, because the people providing it were taken care of. But somewhere along the way, that vision had been lost, and now he was staring at the wreckage. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "Why do you stay?" Clara hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I thought maybe I could make a difference. That I could hold this place together, even if it's falling apart around me. But I don't know anymore. Sometimes it feels like I'm just waiting for the day they decide I'm too old, too slow, and they replace me with someone who won't talk back." Her words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of how far things had fallen. The CEO met her gaze, his expression resolute. "You're not just holding this place together, Clara. You're the reason it hasn't completely fallen apart, and I promise you, that's going to change." Clara studied him for a long moment, her skepticism slowly giving way to cautious hope. "We'll see," she said quietly. "But if you're serious about fixing this, you'd better be ready for a fight. Klein's not going to go quietly, and there are more like him out there." "I'm ready," he said without hesitation. "This starts here, tonight." For the first time that night, Clara smiled. A small, weary smile, but a smile nonetheless. Then let's get to work. The air in the break room was thick with the weight of Clara's words, but for the first time all night there was a flicker of hope. The CEO sat down at the rickety table, the folder of complaints spread before him like an indictment of everything that had gone wrong. Clara leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and watchful. She wasn't entirely convinced yet, but she was willing to listen. That was a start. "We need to start with accountability," the CEO said, his voice steady but quiet. "Klein can't stay here. Not after everything I've seen tonight." Clara raised an eyebrow, her skepticism returning. "And how exactly do you plan to make that happen? He's been here for years. He knows how to cover his tracks." "I'm the CEO," he replied, a hard edge creeping into his tone. "His tracks won't matter once I'm done. But firing him isn't enough. We need to rebuild trust. With you, with Jamie, with everyone on this team." Clara gave him a long look, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. Finally she nodded. "All right. If you're serious about this, I'll help. But you need to understand. Klein isn't the only problem. He's just the one you can see. The real issue is the way this company runs. You want to make a difference? You have to go deeper than one bad manager." The CEO leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then tell me everything. I need to know what's broken if I'm going to fix it." Clara hesitated, glancing toward the door as though to make sure no one was listening. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, each word deliberate. "It started small. Budget cuts, new policies, tighter controls. At first it was just inconvenient. Fewer hours to go around, stricter quotas. But then it got worse. Klein started threatening people, cutting shifts if they didn't meet impossible expectations. He'd fudge the numbers to make it look like we were hitting targets, and no one questioned it because the store was turning a profit." She paused, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "And the complaints you found? Most of them never even made it out of this store. Klein would intercept them, either shred them or stash them in that back room. He made it clear that if anyone went above his head, they'd be out of a job." The CEO felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "Why didn't anyone call the corporate hotline? That's supposed to be anonymous." Clara laughed bitterly. "Anonymous? Sure. Except Klein made it his business to find out who was behind every call. He'd watch the schedules, look for patterns, figure out who wasn't happy. And once he did, they were gone. One way or another." The CEO sat back, the enormity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just a failure of oversight, it was a deliberate exploitation of the very systems that were supposed to protect employees. And it had been happening right under his nose. "What about the other employees?" he asked. "Are they afraid to speak up too?" Clara nodded. "Most of them are just trying to keep their heads down. They've got families to feed, bills to pay. They can't afford to lose this job, no matter how bad it gets. That's why Jamie stays, why I stay." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always believed in the ideals he'd built his company on: fair treatment, opportunity, respect. But those ideals meant nothing if the people on the ground were living in fear. "I need to talk to Jamie," he said suddenly. "They deserve to know that things are going to change." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Jamie's been through a lot. They're tough, but they're also just a kid. If you're going to talk to them, you'd better mean what you say, because if you let them down, it'll break them." "I won't," he said firmly. The CEO found Jamie near the front of the store, their broom resting against the counter as they meticulously folded a pile of shopping bags. They looked up when he approached, their expression cautious but polite. "Hey," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Got a minute?" Jamie hesitated, glancing toward the manager's office. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong," he assured them. "I just wanted to talk." Jamie nodded slowly, leaning against the counter. "Okay. What's up?" The CEO took a deep breath. "I know things haven't been easy here. I've seen how hard you're working and I've heard some of what you've been dealing with, and I want you to know it's not okay. None of it is okay." Jamie blinked, their expression shifting to one of confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I mean Klein," he said plainly. "The hours, the threats, the way he's been treating everyone here, it's not right. And I promise you, it's going to change." Jamie's eyes widened slightly, but they quickly looked away, their hands fidgeting with the hem of their apron. "I don't know what you think you can do," they muttered. "People like him don't just go away." "He will," the CEO said firmly. "And when he does, you'll get the hours you deserve, the pay you deserve, the respect you deserve." Jamie looked up at him then, their expression a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Why do you care? You don't even work here." "I do," he said quietly. "I'm the CEO of this company." The color drained from Jamie's face. "Wait, you're serious?" "I am. And I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry it's taken me this long to see what's really going on, but now that I do, I'm going to make it right. For you, for Clara, for everyone." Jamie stared at him, their mouth opening and closing as though they wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, they nodded, their expression still cautious but tinged with something that looked like hope. "Okay," they said softly. "I guess we'll see." "You will," he promised. As Jamie returned to their tasks, the CEO felt a flicker of resolve ignite within him. The road ahead was long, and the damage ran deep, but for the first time, he felt certain that change was possible. And it would start here, with this store, on this night. The next morning, the CEO returned to the store, not as a nameless observer, but as the leader who had let it fall into disrepair. He stood before the employees, his identity now fully revealed, and looked into their tired, skeptical faces. Clara stood at the edge of the group, her arms crossed, while Jamie lingered in the back, their broom forgotten. For the first time in years, the CEO felt vulnerable, stripped of the power his title usually carried. "I failed you," he began, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "This company was built on the idea that everyone deserves respect, dignity, and a chance to thrive. Somewhere along the way I lost sight of that, and you paid the price." The room was silent, but the weight of his words was palpable. He took a deep breath and continued. "But today, that changes. Starting now, you'll see more than promises. You'll see action. Klein is gone. Your hours will be fair. Your pay will reflect your worth. And I'm not leaving this store until I've personally spoken to every one of you about what you need to make this a better place to work." Clara's expression softened, her guarded skepticism giving way to a glimmer of cautious hope. Jamie nodded slightly, a small, hesitant smile breaking through. As the meeting ended, employees began to trickle back to their tasks, their steps lighter than before. Clara lingered, her voice low but steady. "Talk is cheap," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm staying to help." That day, the CEO worked alongside his employees, stocking shelves, sweeping floors, and listening to their stories. For the first time, he didn't just see a store, he saw people. And with that realization, everything began to change.